Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melissa Carlson, and I am the on-farm research coordinator for Minnesota Wheat. So Charlie kind of touched on us a little bit for when he was talking about the Wheat Council, but kind of like he mentioned, the Wheat Council, part of the checkoff dollars that you guys pay to the Wheat Council help fund the on-farm research network. Need a clicker. And it's not just me coordinating. We also, Chris Matter, we've hired him on. He also helps with doing the on-farm network stuff too, helping out in the field as well in the office. So we have two coordinators working on the network. And so like I mentioned, we're funded by the Wheat Checkoff. And then if you guys haven't really heard of us, I'm guessing if you've been here for the last several years, you have heard of us. But we also work with the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. They funded a few grants to help us look at some fertilizer and cover crop trials that have involved soybeans. And then we also have partnered with AFREC to look at some different fertilizer trials as well. And so AFREC is the fertilizer checkoff. And so kind of how we are set up, so how on-farm trials are set up, we're not like doing this like small plot trials. It's not small plot trials on the farm. We're doing full field scale strip trials. And so this is something, so kind of how it works is I might have contacted some of you in the room also in previous years. But generally we put together a protocol and we find growers who are interested in testing whatever new practice that we're trying to look at, whether it be fertilizers, different fungicides, seeding rates, different things like that. And so we kind of put together a replicated strip trial and to put it out in the field, kind of using your equipment, your seeder, spreader, and combine to collect the data. And we replicate this at several sites throughout the region each year. So that way we can kind of group everybody's data together to get a better look at what the actual response is. So we're not just looking at, what happened in one field in 1 year. And so we do randomized replicated strip trials in multiple locations. Usually we try to do these for at least 3 years so we can get multiple growing environments, multiple years with different weather patterns to look at the responses there. So this year we started some new research trials. We looked at, sorry, that's a little bit small to read. I should mention, you guys should all have in kind of your booklet packets, you guys should all have our annual on-farm research report. So this is all of our data results from this year. And so if you can't see what's on the slides, all the slides that I'm going to be talking about are in this book, and you can follow along in there as well. And so this year we looked at foliar copper applications, not just on peat soils, but we were looking at mineral soils. So copper, guys farming peat soils, generally it's common practice to apply copper sulfate because the peat really ties up the copper, but at the prodding on some crop consultants that we worked with, we wanted to look at copper deficiencies on mineral soils that were testing low in copper. And so we applied a copper chelate at tillering, which I'll get into a little bit here. We also started a new trial looking at polyhalite as a source of sulfur versus AMS. We tried different nitrogen rates on wheat in kind of a new trial that we're trying to look at nitrogen rate response by different varieties or by current varieties that you guys are growing. And we finished our last year of our rotational elevated P and K fertility. So this was kind of following higher applications of P and K through 4 years of rotation through wheat and soybeans to see where, if we could boost wheat yield or soybean yield and kind of if there was any luxury consumption going on there. We also started a rye cover crop termination timing trial to kind of continue our delve into cover crops and how we can try and figure out how to make them work up here. And then we also looked at a rock rolling wheat trial, which I didn't even realize that folks were rock rolling their wheat in some areas. So we just wanted to kind of check on that to see if there is any response. So I'm going to highlight just a handful of our trials here, but all of the results from each of the trials are in your booklets that you have in front of you also. So I was talking about the foliar copper trial. And so I had mentioned that we were targeting soils that were low testing in copper. So generally the ag, kind of the literature and AgVise recommends applying copper if you're below 0.4 parts per million on your soil tests, which is usually actually pretty common in some of your sandier soils, or your sandy knobs tend to be lower in copper. And so just simple treatments, we're looking at control, no added copper, and then the product that we got donated to us was Elemax. And so that's a copper chelate, and we applied that alone at tillering, although you can tank mix it if you choose to do it on your own. And so this year, you guys remember the spring was really hectic. So we had about 8 sites lined up for this trial, but we were only actually able to get 2 of them in and harvested. So I was hoping to have a lot more data for you guys, but we just have the 2 locations for this year. We'll have more continuing on next year. So we got 2 sites. One was up in Roosevelt, up towards Lake of the Woods, and then the other was somewhat closer to this way down over by Beltrami. About 2.73% soil organic matter on those fields, but both of them were below that 0.4 parts per million threshold for copper. And those were just composite soil tests that they'd taken last year, or I should say in the fall of 21. One site up in Roosevelt, I highlighted there, I just wanted to mention, I use Climate Field View to collect our rain data, so it's just an estimate of what their rain was for the summer, but in Roosevelt they only got about 5 inches of rain, so that was definitely a lower rain site. And then in Beltrami they got 11.5 inches of rain this season, and so I think that definitely affected the yield results that we had here. So that Beltrami site that got the rain was able to yielding up in the kind of 85, 90s. So we did actually see a significant response with the copper application in Beltrami. But Roosevelt, we did not. Like I mentioned before, if rain is your limiting factor, it doesn't matter how much copper you apply, it's not going to help. So that is what we have for this year with those 2 sites. So it was encouraging results to see that we actually did get to see something, and so I'm excited to continue that trial on for next year. And so if any of you guys are interested in maybe trying this one out, it's a pretty easy test to run. We just need a soil test from your previous fields from this last fall, and we can go from there. So definitely catch me at the end if you guys want to try any of these trials that we talk about. Another trial that I wanted to highlight that we started this year, so we were working with a company out of the UK actually to test polyhalite. This is a new fertilizer. It's not quite on the market yet, but they're planning on releasing it sometime in the near future. And it's a kind of a potassium sulfur fertilizer, and then it also has a little bit of magnesium and calcium in it as well. So it's just a natural mineral that they mine out of the ground. So they haven't processed it or anything, so it's actually qualified as organic also. But basically it comes out in pearls about the size of urea, so it's a granular that you just mix in with the rest of your fertilizers. And so there's about 14% potassium and 19% sulfur is the analysis on there. And so our objective with this trial was to actually use it as a sulfur source. In Iowa, I think they've done tests looking at it as a potassium source on corn, but for our trials, we just looked at it as a sulfur source on wheat. And our objective was just to see if it could be a viable alternative. If we use the polyhalite, is there going to be any effect on yield or protein, and what that effect might be. And so our treatments were we balanced the fertilizer rates between each of them and just swapped out the source of sulfur, polyhalite versus AMS. And so we had 4 sites of this, and this year, sorry, let me know if you guys can't see. I keep stepping in front of you. So we had 4 sites, one in Mentor, we had 2 near Red Lake Falls, and then 1 up by Stephen. And this year we had no significant differences in yield between, for any of the sites, but for any of the treatments. So I think that was encouraging to see that it didn't affect yield, because I would hate for it to have a negative effect on yield. But at least if it's not going to increase yield, at least it can have, at least having no difference is also helpful as well. One site did have a slight statistically significant response to protein. With the AMS, it was 0.3 higher on the protein. I wouldn't exactly call that an agronomic response at this point, but I just wanted to highlight that there. And then I also, in the tables in your booklets, I just wanted to include, we did soil testing afterwards. We saw some kind of funky residual soil sulfur tests afterwards. We got some really super high numbers on the sulfur test, but so I have it here, but as Dave Franzen always says, the sulfur test really isn't worth much, so I guess I don't put much stock into these numbers either. So. And so kind of the key takeaways we have so far for this year was that there wasn't any difference between the two fertilizer sources, and so we'll be continuing this on next year as well. One trial that we've been working on finishing up from the last 4 years is the elevated P and K fertility trial. And so, sorry, I think my type got a little small on this, but you guys can read it in your books. The slides in the SGU PowerPoint also start on page 15 if you have those books open also. So this trial, our objective was to determine if there's a way we can boost soybean yield and potentially wheat yield by applying extra phosphorus and potassium. And so we did this in conjunction with the University of Minnesota. The Magnuson Research Farm up in Roseau actually had some small plots that went along with this trial. And so in the small plots, they had all the different, we had 6 different rates of P, and then 6 different rates of K, and then the different combinations of P and K there with the control. But then our large plot farmer experiments, it was just adding the farmer control, so whatever the farmer's P and K rates were, compared to adding an extra 50 units each of P and K. And so we did this each year over the same exact test plots for 4 years in a wheat and soybean rotation. And so in the small plots this year, let's see, so this is kind of a slide I borrowed from Dave Grafstrom. So Dave Grafstrom is the other kind of one person in charge of this trial. And so he was in charge of the small plots, and kind of a summary that he gave from the small plots up in Roseau this year. They had good yields. They had a lot of rain this year, at least up in Roseau, which helped with the soybean yields. Wheat had good protein, but they didn't see any differences in wheat or soybean yields between the control and the treatments. I didn't include these, but he did say, one thing he did note that he did actually have aphids attacking the low fertilizer treatments. His high fertilizer treatments, they were green and they were just fine, but actually some of the soybeans had phosphorus or potassium deficiencies, and the aphids were actually going after those beans. So that was something interesting that he noted. In our large plot yields, we just had a site in Badette and Elbow Lake this year. We did have 3 other large plot sites, but unfortunately in the jumble of this spring, they had to rotate out or it was lost to prevent plants. So we lost 3 of those sites this spring. So in Badette, it was wheat this year, it was soybeans this year. And it just kind of ended up being a kind of lower yielding year for it. Wasn't a great year for him. And so we didn't see any difference between the control and the treatment. In Elbow Lake, it was wheat, and he actually did have a really great year. Field average was kind of 85, 90s up there. And so we actually did see a 4 or 5 bushel difference between the elevated treatment and the control. And so it was a high yielding year, and so having that extra fertility out there actually did help boost his yield this year. And so Dave, kind of just to summarize that, so in Badette we didn't have any differences. Elbow Lake we did, but I just kind of was penciling out the numbers on the cost of that fertilizer, especially with this year's prices. versus the yield gain that he got. And really at $6 bushel wheat, I mean just $6 wheat with the fertilizer prices this year would take 9.2 bushels to break even, a 9 bushel yield gain to break even. So even though we did see a yield increase, I don't think that yield increase is going to pay for the extra fertilizer there. And same with the soybeans. Another trial that I was really excited to start this year and to continue on this year, looking at nitrogen rates on high-yielding wheat varieties. And this is something I talked a little bit with Dan Kaiser about, to work with him a little bit. He would like to see some new nitrogen rate response trials up in this area with wheat. And so we wanted to just compare yield, protein, and profitability on various rates of nitrogen on some of our newer and current varieties. And to compare kind of maybe some of the high yield, low protein varieties to the maybe slightly lower yield, high protein varieties, and what the nitrogen rate response is and the profitability of those practices also. And so this was also our first trial where we've done just strictly based on application map and yield map. And so it was actually really easy for the growers to apply. They didn't really have to do much work at all. So we had 6 rates of nitrogen. So there was 0, 60, 90, 120, 150, and then 180 units of nitrogen put out. And each of those plots is about 1 acre. So it was 140 by about 400 feet. So it was one round of the spreader wide. And so I wrote that into a prescription map so that way the spreader could just apply the plot by itself. And then we had our in-season data collection, and actually before harvest, we actually went out and hand harvested protein samples because we knew we wouldn't be able to collect it when you guys were harvesting, or when they were harvesting, because it would be awful trying to collect weigh wagon and protein data with this kind of plot setup. So we actually walked and took hand samples of the protein prior to harvest, and then ran them through the plot commons at UMC. They were able to help us get those threshed out so we could collect our protein data. And then the farmer was just able to combine regularly, and I just extracted the yield data from the yield map. And so we had just 2 sites of this year. We didn't want to get too crazy just to see how this would all work, since it was our first time doing our plots this way. So we had 1 site in East Grand Forks and 1 site in Red Lake Falls, and both were planted to 95-90. The East Grand Forks site got, I think you guys have the rain data in the book. I forgot to put it up on the slides here. East Grand Forks site got a little bit less rain than the Red Lake Falls site. And I think that might have driven some of the results that we got here. So the East Grand Forks site's yield average was in the 60s, 70s. With that control is all the way down at 57 bushels. And with 180 units of nitrogen, it was at 73 bushels. And so there was kind of a interesting response going on here, but I ran the partial profit. So when I put the numbers to it, I included, I calculated at $8 wheat. I included protein discount or premiums and discounts at 5 cents a fifth, since that was what it was when at the time I was doing it or making the table. And then with the urea price at about $800 a ton. And actually, in this site, the 60 units of nitrogen treatment was actually the most profitable. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And there was kind of some funny protein responses going on there that were kind of consistent across all the reps and treatments. So I don't really have a good explanation of why, other than maybe it just got less rain. If water was the yield limiting factor, maybe the lower nitrate, that would make a lower nitrogen treatment more economical, since if you're limited on water, the nitrogen response you're not going to have a nitrogen response for those yields. In Red Lake Falls, we had kind of field average around 80 bushels. The 0 nitrogen treatment was about 70 bushels, which I thought it was really interesting. He still got 70 bushels with no applied nitrogen. And then with 180 units of nitrogen, it's 87 bushels there, so almost 90 bushels. So it's about a 20 bushel spread there across the nitrogen rates. And then, so yield and protein both responded as we would expect with the different nitrogen rates. So yield went up, protein content also increased from 11.8 all the way up to 14.5 here. And that was, I think, rain wasn't exactly a limiting factor here, and so that's why I think we saw a more typical nitrogen rate response. The profit analysis wasn't statistically significant, but I mean, just kind of looking at the averages, profit increased with more or less with nitrogen rate. And so this was just kind of first year data that we got with this trial. Our goal is to see this or spread this among more different varieties. So we want to try additional varieties. I would love to get them on fields like with Trigger, a really super high yielding variety with pretty low protein content, and also compare that to fields maybe more typical like Linkert or Rothsey. Just to kind of compare those to the university varieties though, or university varieties, and then also more west bred fields also, just to see if we can start kind of gauging a response, nitrogen response by variety. One more trial that I'd like to touch on. So we've been doing a little bit more with cover crops over the last several years. And originally we started with just looking at rye versus no rye and seeding those soybeans into the rye. We've kind of stepped that up a little bit and started working with the University of Minnesota, working with Angie Peltier. She's the extension row crops educator up in Crookston, and then Jody DeYoung-Hughes is an extension educator based out of Wilmer, and she's usually talking at these events about tillage and soil health, if you've come across her before. And so we're working with them to look at rye termination timings, different rye termination timings when we're green seeding those soybeans into rye. So we had sites that we would plant rye following wheat harvest. So about September last year, they went in towards the end of September, at least following wheat. So we planted rye at about 30 pounds per acre. It was drilled in just with his air seeder. And then in this spring, we terminated those at about 7 days before soybean planting, at soybean planting, or within about a day of soybean planting, and then 1 week after soybean planting. And so this trial, we're doing it in a wheat soybean rotation, then also a corn soybean rotation. So we had several sites down in kind of west central Minnesota. Those were corn. Rye was flown into corn and then went to soybeans this last year in 2022. And we originally had 3 sites planned in northern Minnesota. We just ended up with 1 this season in Gently, and that was wheat planted with rye and then planted to soybeans in 2022. And so I'm going to focus on Gently since I'm mostly focused on the wheat soybean rotation, at least for this presentation. In 2021, you guys remember we had a huge volunteer wheat problem. And so the volunteer wheat actually grew up in this field. He didn't do anything to control the wheat, so the volunteer wheat headed out. We're kind of worried about it choking out the rye, or we're wondering if it was going to choke out the rye, but the rye actually came back just fine and grew up through that. We were kind of worried about the residue that volunteer wheat would leave behind, so that's why I wanted to throw this picture in there. So before it frosted out, the volunteer wheat was headed out, and at some point of grain fill, I think if it would have had a couple more weeks, he could have harvested it again. But by spring, by the time it came to soybean planting, most of that residue had already broken down. And so he was actually just to take his regular single disc drill and drill through the extra wheat residue and then also the rye residue also, or the rye tissue also. So the treatments that we had in Gently were just a regular control. He's just, this farmer pretty much just does fall vertical tillage You might do a couple passes with the Sulfur, but that's kind of what he's gone to, is just using the Sulfur as compared to using the chisel plow and the cultivator. And then in first termination timing was about right at the end of May. So the soybeans were planted, I believe, on June 6th or 7th this year. And part of the story to tell with that, so usually we would not planting soybeans in June, or that late in June. And so this rye had actually gotten way bigger than we had ever intended it. So I think this year ended up being a kind of a worst case scenario. So by the time we got to soybean planting, the rye had already headed out. So with that first termination timing, the rye was about in boot stage, and then it was headed by the time we got to planting, and then close to anthesis by the time we got to our 1 week after planting timing. But I think his single disc drill, without any extra modifications or row cleaners, I think it did a pretty good job of getting the soybeans in the ground through all that residue. So yield was at this site was actually kind of interesting. Our worst treatment was actually terminating the rye before planting. The control without rye was about 44 bushels. Our terminating 1 week before planting was at 35 bushels, so that was about a 10 bushel yield drop, and you could definitely see it out in the field. That treatment did a lot worse. The soybeans were a lot shorter and got held back. But then terminating the rye at planting, and then after planting still had 41 bushels of soybeans at the end of it. So just about 3 bushels off from that no rye control. And honestly, I do not have an explanation for that or why that happened. I don't know if it's just because that first termination timing at boot, if that residue just broke down a lot faster, if that tied up if that breaking down right away, if that tied up some extra nutrients or nitrogen in the soil. I'm just not sure. But when the rye had headed out, that residue stayed standing up in the soybeans. And so the soybeans did stretch out a little bit. Stretch out to grow through that rye, and that rye residue stayed standing almost all the way through harvest. I think I need to get through the rest of these. I'm running out of time. We did also monitor a little bit of soil moisture. So with the rye covering the ground, we did retain a little bit more soil moisture during the growing season. I talked about yield. We didn't really have any effects on test weight or protein or any of the soybean quality. So that's kind of what I have that's our first preliminary first year of data with that trial with the different termination timings. Also ended up being a worst case scenario year also. But since I'm getting down there, to our 2023 research trials, we'll be repeating everything that we researched this year, minus the P&K trial. So we'll be looking at, for more sites of foliar copper, the copper applications, looking at polyhalate versus AMS, the nitrogen rates on our higher yielding varieties, more rye. We have 3 rye cover crop termination timing sites that were planted this last fall that we'll be looking at next spring. That was just the wheat soy. We have 3 wheat soybean sites, and then there's 4 corn soybean sites in west central, down south. We have 1 site where we're looking at, that went in this last fall, where we're looking at volunteer wheat as a cover crop. Charlie had kind of touched on it during his MOG presentation, looking at Farm Bill and cover crops and what qualifies as a cover crop. And that's where we're trying to get some data on to maybe hand off to help NRCS or somebody look at how volunteer wheat can help as a cover crop. What kind of stand do you need at the end of the year? What's the benefit to it? And can we use that instead of going in and trying to plant rye, which may or may not grow? We have 1 site where we're looking at a 5-year cover crop rotation with a grower up in Red Lake Falls. And then new next year, we're going to try and start working a little bit on biologicals. I've been talking with the Pivot Bio rep and they are interested in doing some on-farm trials with their wheat products. And so I'm still just kind of waiting to get a protocol for them. So I'm really hoping that we can do some pivot bio trials next year. And then also I've submitted a grant to work with a few growers on a Johnson Sioux bioreactor. I don't have time to explain all of that, but I think it's really neat, and that's also kind of a homegrown biologicals trial that I think would be really interesting, and then also rock rolling wheat. With that, if we have time for one question, I'd love to answer any questions you have, or I'll be here till the end, so you guys can catch me anytime also.
On the cover trial, did you check organic matter before you start, and then after, and then on the lab?
Okay, yep. So the question was, did we check or soil organic matter before and after the cover crop trial? And yes, so the other part of the cover crop trial is actually kind of a huge trial that we're doing with the U of M, and there's a whole slew of kind of soil health tests that they've been doing. And Anna Cates at the U of M, she's the one heading that up. I don't have any of the soil data, the soil health data yet, but we should have that eventually, and then we'll be able to give that to you guys.
Did you do the rolling wheat this year?
Yes, so we did the rolling wheat. We just had one site and 1 year, so I didn't include it in books or our results yet, but there was no difference in rock rolling wheat versus not rock rolling the wheat for the site that we had this year. We did, for that trial, we took stand counts and just the yield, and so there was no difference in stand counts or yield, although the grower did notice, we didn't see it in the yield, but the grower did notice that where he'd rolled, it dried out and sealed up a lot faster than where he hadn't. And I think he said that had, I have to ask again, that did have an effect, I think, on the yield, the wheat height, he thought. All right, with that, I think I will wrap it up, and I think next we have the Clay Wilkin County meeting.